She stepped off that train carrying everything she owned in one worn suitcase, only to hear the man who'd sent for her say 5 words that would shatter her in front of the whole town. "I don't want you anymore." The platform went silent. Every eye turned toward her, and just when Willa Hart thought she'd hit rock bottom in Red Hollow, a stranger with 2 frightened children and a face carved from years of grief crossed the street and offered her something she never expected, a second chance she hadn't asked for. If you're curious how a woman with nothing rebuilt a family that had forgotten how to live, stick around until the end of this story. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind off the high desert cut through Willa's threadbare coat like it had a personal grudge. She stood alone on the platform at Red Hollow Station, clutching her suitcase with both hands, watching the man who was supposed to marry her turn his back and walk away without a second glance. Calvin Pike hadn't even waited for the train to pull out before he'd made his decision. He'd taken one long look at her, dusty dress, plain face, hands roughened from years of work, and decided she wasn't worth the price of the ticket he'd sent. "I expected someone younger," he'd said flatly, loud enough for the dozen people lingering near the platform to hear. "Someone prettier. This won't work." Willa had opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could she say? That she was 24, not 40? That the journey had been long and the third-class car had no mirrors? That she'd spent every cent she had just to get here? Calvin Pike didn't care. He tugged his hat lower and walked back toward the general store without looking back. The platform emptied slowly. A few women whispered behind gloved hands. An older man shook his head and turned away. Nobody approached her. Nobody offered help. Willa set her suitcase down carefully and smoothed her skirts, trying to steady the shaking in her hands. She'd left Illinois with nothing but hope and a single letter promising a new life. Now she stood in a town that didn't want her, with no money, no ticket home, and no plan. The station master, a wiry man with graying sideburns, approached her cautiously. "Miss, the train's leaving in 10 minutes. You getting back on?" "I don't have fare," Willa said quietly. He frowned. "Then where are you planning to go?" She didn't answer because she didn't have one. The station master sighed, glanced toward the street, then lowered his voice. "Look, I can't let you sleep here. Town doesn't take kindly to drifters. You got family? Friends?" Willa shook her head. "Then you're in a bad spot." He wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. "Best I can suggest is you find work fast or start walking before someone decides you're trouble." He left her standing there. The train whistle blew. The engine belched steam and iron wheels began to turn. Willa watched it pull away, taking with it the last thread connecting her to the life she'd left behind. She was alone. Across the street, a man leaned against a post outside the lumber yard, watching her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. 2 children stood beside him, a boy about 9, sullen and watchful, and a little girl no older than 5, half hidden behind her brother's leg. The man pushed off the post and crossed the street. Willa straightened, unsure whether to be hopeful or afraid. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with eyes that seemed to measure everything and give away nothing. "You the one Pike sent for?" "I was," Willa said. "Where you headed now?" "I don't know yet." The man glanced back toward his children, then returned his gaze to her. "You got work lined up?" "No." "Place to stay?" "No." He was quiet for a moment, as if weighing something heavy. Then he said, "I'm Seth Mercer. I got a cabin on the edge of town. It's small, but there's a spare room. You can stay there until you figure things out." Willa blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because standing here won't help either of us," Seth said. "And because I got 2 kids who need looking after while I work. You help with that? We'll call it even." It wasn't charity. It was a transaction. Willa understood that immediately. "I can cook," she said, "and clean. I'm good with children." Seth nodded. "Then pick up your bag and follow me." He turned and walked back toward the children without waiting for her answer. Willa hesitated only a moment before lifting her suitcase and following him down the dusty street. Dorsik. The cabin sat at the end of a rutted path lined with scrub pine and wind-bent grass. It was small, weathered, built from rough-cut timber that had gone gray with age. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a pair of chickens scratched in the dirt near the front steps. Seth pushed the door open and stepped inside. The boy followed immediately. The little girl lingered on the threshold, staring at Willa with wide, uncertain eyes. "It's all right," Willa said gently. "I'm Willa." The girl didn't answer, just ducked inside after her brother. Willa stepped into the cabin and set her suitcase down near the door. The interior was dim and spare. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. An iron stove squatted in the corner, radiating weak heat. Shelves lined one wall, mostly empty. A narrow doorway led to what looked like a single bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was more than Willa had expected an hour ago. Seth gestured toward a small alcove off the main room. "That's where you'll sleep. It's got a cot and a blanket. Not fancy, but it's dry." "It's fine," Willa said. "Thank you." Seth didn't acknowledge the gratitude. He moved toward the stove and added a log from the woodpile. "The boy's name is Eli. The girl's Rosie. They don't talk much to strangers, so don't take it personal." Willa glanced at the children. Eli stood near the table, arms crossed, watching her like she might steal something. Rosie sat on the floor near the stove, clutching a faceless cloth doll. "Understood," Willa said. Seth straightened and wiped his hands on his trousers. "I work at the mill 6 days a week, sun up to sundown most days. I need someone here to keep the house running and make sure the kids don't burn the place down or wander off." "I can do that." "Good." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. People in this town talk. They're going to have opinions about you staying here. Don't let it get to you." "I won't." Seth studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe her. Then he pulled his hat on and stepped outside, leaving Willa alone with 2 children who looked at her like she was an intruder. The first night was silent. Willa cooked a simple supper: beans, cornbread, and the last of a salted pork shoulder she found hanging in the lean-to. She set the table carefully, poured water into tin cups, and called the children to eat. Eli sat down without a word. Rosie climbed into her chair and stared at her plate. Seth arrived just as the sun dropped behind the ridge. He washed his hands at the basin near the door, sat down, and began eating without comment. Nobody spoke. Willa ate slowly, watching the way Rosie picked at her food and the way Eli's jaw tightened every time she moved. This wasn't a family. It was 3 people surviving in the same space. After supper, Seth pushed his chair back. "I'll be outside checking the fence." He left. Willa cleared the table and washed the dishes in silence. Rosie wandered over and stood nearby, watching her hands move through the soapy water. "Do you want to help?" Willa asked quietly. Rosie shook her head but didn't leave. Eli, sitting near the stove, muttered, "She don't talk much." "That's all right," Willa said. "Neither do I, sometimes." Eli didn't respond. When the dishes were done, Willa sat down near the stove and pulled a small sewing kit from her suitcase. One of Rosie's dresses, draped over a chair, had a torn hem. Willa picked it up and began stitching. Rosie drifted closer, watching. "Is this yours?" Willa asked. Rosie nodded. "It's a pretty color," Willa said, running the thread carefully through the fabric. "I'll have it fixed in a minute." She worked quietly, her hand steady. When she finished, she held the dress up and smiled. "Good as new." Rosie took the dress carefully, her fingers brushing Willa's hand for just a second. Then she turned and disappeared into the bedroom. Eli watched the whole exchange without saying a word. The days blurred together. Willa woke before dawn, stoked the fire, and made breakfast. Seth ate quickly and left for the mill. The children moved through the cabin like ghosts, Eli silent and watchful, Rosie clinging to her doll. Willa cleaned. She swept the floors, scrubbed the table, organized the shelves. She mended clothes, patched a hole in the roof where rain had started seeping through, and replanted the sad little vegetable garden behind the cabin that had gone to weeds. She didn't ask for permission. She just did the work. Seth noticed, but he didn't comment. One evening, he came home to find the cabin filled with the smell of stew and fresh bread. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the table set with clean plates and a jar of wildflowers Rosie had picked. "Where'd the flowers come from?" he asked. "Rosie found them," Willa said. "I thought they looked nice." Seth's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He sat down and ate, without saying anything more. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, he lingered near the stove instead of heading outside. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. "I know," Willa said, "but I wanted to." Seth looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once and walked out into the dark. 2 weeks in, Rosie fell. She'd been playing near the woodpile when she tripped over a loose board and scraped her knee badly. She didn't cry, just sat there in the dirt, staring at the blood. Willa was outside hanging laundry when she heard Eli shout. She dropped the wet shirt and ran. Rosie's knee was torn and dirty. Willa knelt beside her immediately, speaking in a low, calm voice. "It's all right, sweetheart. Let me see." Rosie's lip trembled, but she didn't pull away. Willa carried her inside, cleaned the wound gently, and wrapped it with a strip of clean linen. The whole time she kept talking, soft, steady words that had nothing to do with the injury and everything to do with keeping Rosie calm. When it was done, Rosie looked up at her with wet eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mama." The cabin went still. Willa froze, the word echoing in her chest like a bell. Rosie's face crumpled. She realized what she'd said and started crying in earnest. Eli, standing near the door, looked stricken. Willa pulled Rosie into her arms and held her tightly. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's okay." But her own throat was tight and her eyes burned. That night, after the children were asleep, Seth sat across from her at the table. "She didn't mean anything by it," he said quietly. "I know," Willa said. Seth's hands rested on the table, rough and scarred. Their mother died 3 years ago. Fever took her fast. Rosie barely remembers her. Willa didn't speak. She just listened. "I've been trying to keep them together," Seth continued, his voice rough. "But I'm not enough. I know that." "You're doing your best," Willa said. Seth shook his head. "My best isn't good enough. They need more than I can give." He stood and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "You didn't sign up for this. If you want to leave, I'll understand." Willa looked at him. This man who'd taken her in when no one else would, who carried his grief like a stone and kept moving anyway. "I'm not leaving," she said. Seth's shoulders sagged just slightly, as if he'd been holding his breath. He nodded once and stepped outside. Willa sat alone in the quiet cabin, listening to the wind move through the pines, and realized something she hadn't expected. She didn't want to leave. For the first time in years, she wanted to stay. A month passed. The cabin changed. Slowly, quietly, it stopped feeling like a place people survived and started feeling like a place they lived. Willa planted herbs near the door. She baked bread every other day, filling the cabin with warmth. She told Rosie stories before bed and let Eli teach her how to stack firewood properly. Seth came home to laughter one evening and stopped outside the door, listening to Willa and Rosie singing while they kneaded dough. He stood there for a long time before he came inside. That night after supper, Eli looked at Willa across the table and said, "You make good biscuits." It was the first real thing he'd said to her in weeks. Willa smiled. "Thank you, Eli." Seth watched the exchange without saying a word, but when Willa glanced at him, she caught the faintest hint of something that might have been relief. But the town hadn't forgotten. Rumors spread quickly in a place like Red Hollow. People whispered that the discarded mail-order bride was living in Seth Mercer's cabin. Some said she was desperate. Others said Seth had gone soft. And then Calvin Pike heard. He'd left town the same day he'd rejected Willa, heading to a neighboring settlement to find another woman. But when he came back and heard that Willa had become part of Seth Mercer's household, something ugly twisted in his chest. He hadn't wanted her, but the idea that someone else did, especially someone respected like Seth, made him furious. So Calvin Pike walked into the saloon one evening, bought a round of drinks, and made sure everyone in Red Hollow knew exactly what he thought about the situation. And word traveled fast. By the time Seth came home 2 nights later, the tension in town had already started to build. He didn't say anything to Willa, but she saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes lingered on the children a little longer than usual. Something was coming. Willa didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it in the air, cold and sharp, like the edge of a blade waiting to fall. The first crack came on a Sunday. Willa had taken the children into town for supplies. Seth had given her a short list and a handful of coins, enough for flour, salt, and maybe a few pieces of candy if there was anything left over. It was the first time she'd walked Red Hollow's main street since the day she'd arrived, and she felt every eye that turned her way. The general store sat at the center of town, its windows dusty and its porch sagging. Willa climbed the steps with Rosie's hand in hers and Eli trailing behind, his face already closed off and wary. Inside, the store smelled like sawdust and tobacco. A handful of women stood near the fabric bolts, their conversation stopping the moment Willa entered. She ignored them and moved toward the counter where the shopkeeper, a heavy-set man named Garrett, was weighing out nails for another customer. Garrett glanced up, saw her, and his expression soured. "What do you need?" "Flour and salt," Willa said evenly, "and a little sugar if you have it." He grunted and turned to pull the items from the shelves behind him. The women near the fabric had resumed talking, but their voices carried. "It's shameful is what it is," one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice. "A woman living in a man's house with no ring on her finger. And with those poor children right there," another added. "What kind of example is that?" Willa's hands tightened on the edge of the counter, but she kept her face blank. Garrett slapped the flour and salt down in front of her. "That'll be $1.20. Willa counted out the coins carefully and slid them across the counter. Garrett scooped them up without a word and turned his back. Rosie tugged on Willa's skirt. "Can we go now?" "In a minute, sweetheart." Willa gathered the supplies into her basket and turned toward the door. The women were still watching, their eyes sharp and judgmental. One of them, a thin woman with graying hair and a pinched mouth, stepped forward. "Excuse me, miss." Willa stopped. The woman's gaze flicked to the children, then back to Willa. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Mrs. Colby. I run the church auxiliary." "Willa Hart," Willa said quietly. Mrs. Colby's smile didn't reach her eyes. "And you're staying with Seth Mercer, I understand." "I am." "For how long?" Willa met her gaze steadily. "I haven't decided yet." Mrs. Colby's expression hardened. "Well, I'm sure you understand how it looks. A single woman living under a widower's roof. People talk, Miss Hart." "Let them," Willa said. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and the store went quiet. Mrs. Colby's face flushed. "I beg your pardon?" "I said let them talk," Willa repeated, her voice calm now. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm helping a man raise his children while he works. If people want to make it into something ugly, that's their choice." Mrs. Colby opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly affronted. Willa turned and walked out of the store, the children following close behind. Outside, Eli looked up at her with something almost like approval. "You didn't let her push you around." "No," Willa said. "I didn't." But her hands were shaking as she led them back down the street toward the cabin. Seth heard about it that same evening. He came home later than usual, his face tight and his movements stiff. Willa had supper waiting, but he barely touched it. Finally, after the children had gone to bed, he spoke. "You had words with Mrs. Colby today." Willa looked up from the mending in her lap. "She had words with me. I just didn't back down." Seth exhaled slowly. "That woman runs half the gossip in this town. You made an enemy today." "I didn't come here to make friends," Willa said. "No, but you live here now," Seth said, his voice harder than she'd heard before. "And when people start talking, it doesn't just affect you, it affects my kids." Willa set the mending aside. "What was I supposed to do? Stand there and let her call me shameful in front of Rosie and Eli?" "I'm not saying you should have," Seth said, rubbing a hand over his face. "But you need to understand how this town works. People here don't forget. And they sure as hell don't forgive." Willa stood, her frustration finally breaking through. "Then maybe this town needs to learn that not every woman who doesn't fit their idea of proper is doing something wrong." Seth stared at her, his jaw working. Then he shook his head and turned toward the door. "I'm going to check the animals." He left without another word. Willa stood alone in the cabin, her chest tight and her hands clenched. She knew he was right. She knew she'd made things harder. But she also knew she couldn't have done anything differently. Because if she'd let Mrs. Colby shame her in front of those children, she would have lost something more important than the town's approval. she would have lost herself. The tension didn't ease. Over the next week, Willa noticed the small shifts, the nods from neighbors that stopped coming, the way people crossed the street when they saw her, the cold silence from the shopkeeper when she went back for more supplies. Red Hollow had decided what she was, and nothing she did would change their minds. But inside the cabin, things were different. Rosie started following Willa everywhere. She'd sit at the table while Willa kneaded bread, asking questions in her soft, halting voice. She'd hold Willa's hand when they fed the chickens. And at night, when Willa tucked her into bed, Rosie would whisper, "Will you stay tomorrow?" And Willa would say, "Yes, sweetheart, I'll stay." Eli was slower to come around, but he was watching. Willa could feel it in the way he lingered near the kitchen when she cooked, or the way he'd ask her opinion on small things, where to stack the firewood, whether the fence needed fixing. One afternoon, he came inside holding a broken axe handle. "Can you fix this?" he asked. Willa looked at the splintered wood and shook her head. "That's beyond fixing. You'll need a new handle." Eli frowned. "Pa doesn't have money for that right now." "Then we'll make one," Willa said. Eli blinked. "You know how?" "I've seen it done. We'll figure it out together." They spent the next 2 hours in the yard shaping a rough piece of pine until it fit the axe head. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but when they were done, Eli tested it and nodded. "It'll work," he said. Willa smiled. "Good." Eli hesitated, then said quietly, "Thanks." It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything. Okay. Seth noticed the changes too. He came home one evening to find Eli and Rosie sitting at the table with Willa, all three of them laughing over something Rosie had said. The sound stopped him in his tracks. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his children laugh like that. Willa looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. "Supper's ready whenever you are." Seth nodded and moved to the basin to wash up, but his mind was somewhere else. He'd spent 3 years trying to hold his family together, and most days it felt like he was failing. The cabin had been a place of survival, not life. The kids had learned to be quiet, to keep their grief locked down, to not expect too much from him because he didn't have it to give. But Willa had walked into that space and shifted everything without even trying. She didn't demand gratitude. She didn't hover or smother. She just existed in the cabin like she belonged there, and somehow that made room for the rest of them to start living again. It scared him, because the more she became part of their lives, the harder it would be when she left. And Seth was certain she would leave eventually. Why would she stay? She had no ties here, no reason to anchor herself to a broken man and his grieving children. So he kept his distance. He was polite, grateful, but careful not to let her see too much. Because if he let himself hope, and she left anyway, it would break what was left of him. 2 weeks later, Calvin Pike came back to town. He rode in on a rented horse, looking pleased with himself and carrying a leather satchel under one arm. He hitched the horse outside the saloon and walked inside like he owned the place. By evening, word had spread that he was back, and by the next morning, everyone knew why. Calvin Pike had brought a contract. Willa was hanging laundry when she heard the commotion. Voices carried from the main street, sharp and agitated. She glanced toward the cabin where Rosie was napping and Eli was chopping kindling, then wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward town. A crowd had gathered near the general store. Willa moved closer, her stomach tightening. Calvin Pike stood in the center of the group, holding up a folded piece of paper. "This here's a legal contract," he was saying, his voice loud and confident. "Signed by Miss Willa Hart herself, agreeing to marry me in exchange for passage to Red Hollow. That makes her my wife by law." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Willa's breath caught. She pushed forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "That's not true." Calvin turned, his grin widening when he saw her. "Well, look who decided to show up. I signed an agreement to travel here and meet you," Willa said, her voice shaking but firm. "You rejected me the day I arrived. That contract means nothing now." Calvin's smile didn't waver. "Contract says you agreed to marry me. Doesn't say anything about me having to like you first." The crowd laughed and Willa's face burned. "You walked away," she said. "In front of everyone, you made it clear you didn't want me." "I changed my mind," Calvin said easily. "A man's allowed to do that." Not about a person, Willa shot back. Calvin stepped closer, his expression hardening. You think you can just move into another man's house and pretend like we don't have an agreement? That's not how this works, sweetheart. Don't call me that, Willa said. Calvin's eyes narrowed. You owe me. I paid for your ticket. I brought you here. And now you're living with Seth Mercer like some kind of... Careful, a voice said from behind Willa. She turned. Seth stood at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable, but his eyes locked on Calvin. Calvin straightened, clearly enjoying the attention. Well, if it isn't the Good Samaritan himself. Tell me, Mercer, you planning to marry her? Or are you just keeping her around for convenience? The crowd went still. Seth didn't answer. He walked forward slowly, his gaze never leaving Calvin's face. That contract doesn't mean anything, Seth said quietly. You gave up your claim the day you turned her away. Calvin laughed. That's not how the law sees it. She signed an agreement, and unless she's got another husband lined up, she belongs to me. Willa's chest tightened. She looked at Seth, but his expression was stone. Calvin pulled a different paper from his satchel and held it up. This here's a letter from a lawyer in Silver City. Says the contract's binding unless she can prove I violated the terms. Which I didn't. Seth's hands curled into fists at his sides. Calvin grinned. So here's how this is going to go. Miss Hart comes with me, or I take this to the magistrate and make sure everyone in this town knows she's been living unlawfully in your house. Your choice. The crowd was watching now, hungry for the drama. Willa felt the weight of their stares, the judgment, the whispers. Seth stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. How much? Calvin blinked. What? How much do you want for that contract? Seth said. Calvin's grin widened. Oh, so now you want to buy her? How much? Seth repeated. Calvin pretended to think. Well, let's see. I'm out the cost of her ticket, plus the time I wasted, plus the inconvenience of coming back here. He paused. I'd say $500 sounds fair. The crowd gasped. $500 was a fortune, more than most men made in a year. Seth's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. Give me 2 days. Calvin laughed. 2 days? You don't have that kind of money, Mercer. I said give me 2 days, Seth repeated, his voice like iron. Calvin studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. Fine, 2 days. But if you don't have it, she comes with me. He tipped his hat to Willa, smirking, and walked away. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves. Willa turned to Seth, her heart pounding. You can't. Not here, Seth said quietly. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. Willa followed, her mind racing. Okay. Oh. Inside the cabin, Seth paced like a caged animal. Willa stood near the stove, her hands trembling. You can't give him $500. You don't have it. I will, Seth said. How? Seth stopped pacing and looked at her. I've been saving for 3 years. Every penny I didn't need to keep us fed and clothed, I put aside. I was saving for a ranch. Willa's stomach dropped. Seth, no, that's your future. That's mine to spend how I see fit, Seth said sharply. And I'm not letting him take you. Willa stared at him, her throat tight. Why? Seth's expression cracked, just for a moment. Because you're part of this family now, whether you meant to be or not. And I don't let people take what's mine. The words hung in the air between them. Willa's eyes burned. I'm not yours, Seth. I know, Seth said quietly. But you could be. The silence stretched. Finally, Willa whispered, What are you saying? Seth looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw fear in his eyes. I'm saying if you stay, I'll make it legal. Not because of some damn contract, but because I'm asking you to. Willa's breath hitched. You don't have to do this. I know, Seth said, but I want to. Willa didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long believing no one would ever choose her, and now this man, this broken, stubborn man, was offering her something she'd never thought she'd have, a choice. I need time to think, she said finally. Seth nodded. You've got 2 days. He walked past her and out into the yard, leaving her standing alone in the cabin with her heart pounding and her world tilting on its axis. Buck. That night, Willa couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow cot in the alcove, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Seth was willing to give up everything he'd worked for to keep her here. Not because he loved her, he'd never said that, but because she mattered to his children, because she'd become part of the fragile thing he was trying to hold together. But what did she want? She thought about the life she'd left behind in Illinois, the factory work, the boarding house, the loneliness. She'd come west hoping for something better, and she'd found it. Not in the way she'd expected, but in the quiet rhythms of this cabin, in the trust of two children who'd learned to smile again, in the presence of a man who carried his grief like armor, but still managed to be kind. She didn't love Seth. Not yet. But she could see the shape of it, the possibility. And that scared her more than anything. The next day, Willa tried to keep things normal. She cooked breakfast, tended the garden, helped Rosie practice her letters, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over Seth's words again and again. Eli noticed. "You okay?" Willa looked up from the pot she was stirring. "I'm fine, Eli." "You don't seem fine." She smiled faintly. "Just thinking." Eli frowned. "About that man, Pike?" Willa hesitated, then nodded. Eli's expression darkened. "Pa's not going to let him take you." "I know." "Then why do you look scared?" Willa set the spoon down and turned to face him. "Because your father's giving up something important to keep me here, and I don't know if I'm worth that." Eli stared at her, his young face suddenly older than it should be. "You are." Willa's throat tightened. "Eli, you are," he repeated more firmly. "You made Rosie stop crying at night. You made this place feel like home again. Pa doesn't smile much, but he does now. Because of you." Willa's eyes burned. "That doesn't mean—" "It does," Eli said. "It means you're part of us. And if you leave, it's going to hurt, so don't." He turned and walked outside before she could respond. Willa stood alone in the kitchen, her hands shaking, tears slipping down her cheeks. Gods. Seth came home late that night, exhausted and covered in sawdust. He'd been at the mill since before dawn, working double shifts to make sure he had every dollar he could scrape together. Willa had kept supper warm. She set it in front of him without a word. Seth ate in silence, his shoulders slumped. When he finished, he looked up at her. "I'll have the money tomorrow." Willa nodded. Seth hesitated. "Have you decided?" Willa sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. "I want to stay." Seth's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "You sure?" "No," Willa said honestly, "but I want to try." Seth exhaled slowly, and for the first time in days, the tension in his face eased. "Okay." "Okay," Willa echoed. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision settling between them. Then Seth stood. "I'm going to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He paused at the door to the bedroom, then looked back at her. "Thank you." Willa's chest ached. "For what?" "For choosing us," Seth said quietly. He disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Willa alone with the flickering lamplight and the knowledge that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Seth went to the bank. He withdrew every dollar he'd saved over the past 3 years. The teller counted it out slowly, her expression carefully neutral, and Seth folded the bills into his coat pocket. It was everything he had, everything he'd worked for, the dream of a ranch, of land that belonged to him, of a future where his children didn't have to struggle. It was all there in his pocket, about to be handed over to a man who didn't deserve it. But when Seth thought about the alternative, watching Willa walk away, seeing the light go out of his children's eyes again, he knew he'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. He walked to the saloon where Calvin was staying and knocked on the door. Calvin opened it, grinning. "Right on time. You got it?" Seth pulled the money out and held it up. "Every cent." Calvin's eyes gleamed. He reached for it, but Seth pulled it back. "The contract first," Seth said. Calvin laughed. "You don't trust me?" "Not even a little." Calvin shrugged and pulled the folded contract from his coat. He tossed it onto the bed. "There. Happy?" Seth picked it up, unfolded it, and read it carefully. It was legitimate. Willa's signature at the bottom, the terms clear. He handed Calvin the money. Calvin counted it slowly, his grin widening with every bill. When he finished, he stuffed it into his coat and tipped his hat. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mercer." Seth didn't respond. He turned and walked out, the contract clutched in his hand. By the time Seth reached the cabin, the sun was high and the air was warm. Willa was outside hanging laundry. She saw him coming and stopped, her hand still gripping a wet shirt. Seth walked up to her and held out the contract. "It's done," he said. Willa took the paper, staring at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "He's gone?" she asked. "He's gone," Seth confirmed. Willa's hands trembled. She looked up at him, her eyes wet. "Seth, I don't know how to—" "You don't have to," Seth said. "Just stay. That's all I'm asking." Willa nodded, unable to speak. Seth reached out and took the contract from her hands. Then, without a word, he walked to the fire pit behind the cabin and tossed it into the flames. They stood together and watched it burn. When the last corner curled into ash, Seth turned to her. "You're free now. No contract, no obligation. You can stay or go, and it's your choice." Willa looked at him, this man who'd given up everything for her without asking for anything in return. "I'm staying," she said. Seth's expression softened. "Good." And for the first time since she'd arrived in Red Hollow, Willa felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The ashes from the burned contract were still warm when Rosie came running around the side of the cabin, her face flushed and her braids coming loose. "Papa, Willa, come quick!" Seth turned immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the axe leaning against the woodpile. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Rosie said, breathless and grinning. "Mrs. Brennan's here. She brought a cake." Willa and Seth exchanged a glance. Mrs. Brennan was the wife of the mill foreman, a sturdy woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and a reputation for speaking her mind. She'd never been unkind to Willa, but she'd never gone out of her way to be friendly either. They followed Rosie around to the front of the cabin where Mrs. Brennan stood on the porch, holding a covered dish and looking slightly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Brennan," Seth said, nodding. "What brings you out here?" "I heard what happened in town," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice brisk. "With that Pike fellow and the contract." She turned to Willa. "And I figured you could use a friendly face about now." Willa blinked, caught off guard. "That's kind of you." Mrs. Brennan waved a hand dismissively. "It's just a cake, nothing fancy, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in Red Hollow is like Mrs. Colby and her crew." She set the dish down on the porch railing. "What you did standing up to that man in the middle of town took guts. And what Seth did—" She glanced at him. "Well, that took guts too." Seth shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing." "You gave up your future for her," Mrs. Brennan said bluntly. "That's not nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Mrs. Brennan looked at Willa. "I don't know what your plans are, but if you're staying, you should know there are people here who'll stand by you. Not many, maybe, but some." Willa's throat tightened. "Thank you." Mrs. Brennan nodded, then turned back toward the road where her wagon waited. "I'll let you folks get back to your day. Enjoy the cake." She climbed onto the wagon and drove off, leaving Willa and Seth standing on the porch with Rosie bouncing excitedly beside them. "Can we eat it now?" Rosie asked. Seth ruffled her hair. "After supper." Rosie groaned but didn't argue. Willa picked up the dish and carried it inside, her chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was bigger than that. It was the realization that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. That evening, after the children had gone to bed and the cake had been reduced to crumbs, Seth sat at the table sharpening his knife while Willa washed the dishes. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but it wasn't easy either. There were things unsaid, questions neither of them knew how to ask. Finally, Willa dried her hands and turned to face him. "What happens now?" Seth looked up, his expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "You spent everything you had to keep me here," Willa said. "But we haven't talked about what that actually means. For you, for the kids, for us." Seth set the knife down and leaned back in his chair. "I don't expect anything from you, if that's what you're asking." "That's not what I'm asking," Willa said. "I'm asking what you want." Seth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want you to stay. I want my kids to be happy. And I want to stop feeling like I'm drowning every single day." The honesty in his voice hit Willa harder than she'd expected. I want that too, she said quietly, but I don't know how to be what you need. Seth looked at her, his eyes steady. You already are. Willa shook her head. I'm not their mother, Seth. I can cook and clean and keep the house running, but I can't replace what they lost. I'm not asking you to replace anyone, Seth said. I'm asking you to be here. That's all. Willa's hands twisted in her apron. And what about you? What are you asking for yourself? Seth hesitated. I don't know yet. It was the most honest answer he could have given, and Willa respected him for it. Okay, she said. Then we'll figure it out as we go. Seth nodded slowly. Yeah, we will. Nods. The next few days passed quietly, but the town had taken notice. Word spread quickly that Seth Mercer had paid $500 to buy out Willa Hart's contract. Some people saw it as noble, others saw it as foolish, and a few saw it as confirmation that something improper was happening in that cabin on the edge of town. Mrs. Colby predictably had plenty to say about it. She held court in the general store one afternoon, her voice carrying through the aisles. $500 for a woman he's not even married to. It's indecent. And those poor children growing up in that environment. One of the younger women, a timid thing named Clara, ventured, But he did it to protect her, didn't he? Mrs. Colby sniffed. Protect her from what? From the consequences of her own choices? She signed that contract willingly. She signed it to survive, Mrs. Brennan said sharply from the other side of the store. And Pike rejected her the day she arrived. The contract was void the moment he walked away. Mrs. Colby turned, her expression icy. That's not for you to decide. No, but it's not for you to judge either, Mrs. Brennan shot back. Seth Mercer is a good man doing his best to raise 2 kids on his own, and that woman's been nothing but a blessing to that household. If you can't see that, then you're not looking. Mrs. Colby's face flushed. I beg your pardon. You should beg hers, Mrs. Brennan said, nodding toward the door where Willa had just entered, a basket over her arm. The store went silent. Willa froze in the doorway, her eyes moving from Mrs. Brennan to Mrs. Colby. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. For a moment she considered turning around and leaving, but then she thought about Seth, about the money he'd spent, about the children who were counting on her to be strong. So she lifted her chin and walked to the counter. Flour and cornmeal, please, she said to Garrett, her voice steady. Garrett hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Colby, then began gathering the items. Mrs. Colby stepped closer, her voice low and cutting. You've caused quite a stir, Miss Hart. I didn't ask to, Willa said. No, but you've benefited from it, haven't you? Mrs. Colby said. A roof over your head, a man willing to ruin himself for you. I wonder what you offered in return. Willa's hands tightened on the counter, but before she could respond, Mrs. Brennan stepped between them. That's enough, Mrs. Brennan said firmly. You've made your opinion clear, Martha. Now let the woman buy her supplies in peace. Mrs. Colby's eyes narrowed, but she stepped back. Willa paid for the items quickly and turned to leave. As she passed Mrs. Brennan, she whispered, Thank you. Mrs. Brennan nodded. You hold your head up, girl. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. Willa walked out into the sunlight, her heart pounding and her hands shaking. But she didn't cry. She refused to give them that. When she got back to the cabin, Eli was outside splitting wood. He looked up as she approached, his eyes sharp. What happened? Nothing, Willa said. Eli set the axe down and crossed his arms. You look like something happened. Willa sighed. Mrs. Colby said some things. Mrs. Brennan stood up for me, that's all. Eli's jaw tightened. What kind of things? It doesn't matter, Willa said. It does if it upset you. Willa set the basket down and looked at him. Eli, people are going to talk. That's just how it is. But as long as we know the truth, their words don't mean anything. Eli didn't look convinced. Pa shouldn't have to deal with this, and neither should you. We're dealing with it together, Willa said gently. That's what families do. Eli's expression softened slightly. You really think we're a family? Willa smiled. I do. Eli nodded slowly, then picked up the axe again. Okay. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, Seth came home to find Willa sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening sky. He sat down beside her without a word. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the pines. Finally, Seth said, "Mrs. Brennan told me what happened at the store." Willa glanced at him. "Of course she did. She also said you handled it well." Willa laughed bitterly. "I didn't handle anything. I just stood there and let her say whatever she wanted." "That's handling it," Seth said. "You didn't run. You didn't fight. You just kept going." Willa looked down at her hands. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Seth. The whispers, the judgment, it's exhausting." Seth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if we got married?" Willa's head snapped up. "What?" "Not because we have to," Seth said quickly, "but because it might make things easier for you, for the kids." Willa stared at him. "You want to marry me to stop people from talking?" "I want to marry you because it's the right thing to do," Seth said, "and because I don't want you to keep suffering because of me." Willa's chest ached. "Seth, you can't marry someone just to protect them." "Why not?" Seth asked. "People marry for worse reasons." "That doesn't make it right." Seth rubbed a hand over his face. "Then what do you want me to do? Because I'm out of ideas here." Willa turned to face him fully. "I want you to stop trying to fix everything. I want you to stop acting like you're the only one responsible for holding this family together. And I want you to be honest with me about what you're actually feeling." Seth's jaw worked. "I'm feeling like I'm failing. Every single day. I can't give my kids the life they deserve. I can't stop the town from treating you like garbage. And I can't even afford to rebuild the dream I gave up for you." "I never asked you to give it up," Willa said. "I know," Seth said. "But I'd do it again." The words sat between them, raw and unfinished. Willa reached out and took his hand. "Then stop blaming yourself for things you can't control and start trusting that maybe, just maybe, we can build something new, together." Seth looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "You really believe that?" "I'm trying to," Willa said. Seth's fingers tightened around hers. "Okay, then I'll try too." The following Sunday, Seth took the family into town for supplies. It was the first time they'd all gone together since the confrontation with Calvin Pike, and Willa could feel the eyes on them the moment they stepped onto the main street. But this time, Seth didn't let go of her arm. And when they walked into the general store, he stood close enough that everyone knew exactly where his loyalty lay. Garrett served them without comment, though his expression was sour. A few people nodded in their direction, others turned away. But Mrs. Brennan was there, and she greeted them warmly. "Morning, Mercers." The word hung in the air. Mercers, plural, like Willa already belonged. Seth nodded. "Morning." Mrs. Brennan leaned in and said quietly to Willa, "You keep doing what you're doing, girl. People will come around eventually, and if they don't, well, that's their loss." Willa smiled. "Thank you." As they left the store, Rosie tugged on Willa's hand. "Why was Mrs. Brennan smiling at you like that?" "Because she's a kind person," Willa said. "Are there more kind people here?" Rosie asked. Willa glanced at Seth, who was watching the street with a wary expression. "I think there are more than we realized." But not everyone was kind. 2 days later, Eli came home from town with a black eye and skinned knuckles. Willa was in the kitchen when he walked in, and she gasped. "What happened?" Eli shrugged, trying to look unconcerned. "Got in a fight." "With who?" Seth demanded, stepping in from the yard. "Tommy Fletcher," Eli muttered. "He said some things." Seth's expression darkened. "What kind of things?" Eli looked at Willa, then away. "About her. About you. About us." Seth's jaw clenched. "What did he say?" "It doesn't matter," Eli said. "It does," Seth said firmly. Eli hesitated, then said quietly, "He said Willa was your whore, and that you were stupid for wasting your money on her." Willa's breath caught. Seth's face went cold. "Did you hit him?" "Yeah," Eli said. "Twice. Before his brother pulled me off." Seth crossed the room and gripped Eli's shoulder. "You did the right thing." Eli looked up, surprised. "I thought you'd be mad." "I'm not mad at you," Seth said. "I'm proud of you. You stood up for this family. That's what men do." Eli's eyes shone, and he nodded quickly. Willa knelt down in front of him and gently touched his bruised face. "Let me clean this up." She fetched a cloth and some water and carefully dabbed at the cut above his eye. Eli winced but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry you had to hear those things," Willa said softly. "I'm not," Eli said, "because they're wrong. And I wanted them to know it." Willa's throat tightened. "You're a good boy, Eli." "I'm not a boy anymore," Eli said. "I'm almost 10. Willa smiled despite herself. "You're right. You're not." That night, after the children were asleep, Seth sat at the table staring into his cup of coffee. Willa sat across from him, watching the tension in his shoulders. "You can't fight everyone who says something cruel," she said quietly. "I know," Seth said, "but I can make sure my son knows he was right to defend you." Willa's chest ached. "He shouldn't have to." "No, he shouldn't," Seth agreed. "But until people in this town learn to keep their mouths shut, he's going to hear things, and I'd rather he hear them and know how to respond than let them go unchallenged." Willa reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Thank you." Seth looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "For what?" "For making me part of this," Willa said. "For letting me belong." Seth turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "You've always belonged, from the first day." Willa didn't trust herself to speak, so she just held his hand and let the silence settle around them. The weeks that followed were easier in some ways and harder in others. Inside the cabin, life took on a rhythm. Willa cooked and cleaned and cared for the children. Seth worked long hours at the mill, coming home tired but less tense than before. Rosie laughed more. Eli smiled occasionally, and slowly, the weight of grief that had hung over the household began to lift. But outside the cabin, the town remained divided. Some people, like Mrs. Brennan, accepted Willa without question. Others, like Mrs. Colby, continued to spread rumors and cast judgment, and a few simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. One afternoon, Willa was at the well drawing water when a woman she didn't recognize approached her. The woman was young, maybe a few years older than Willa, with a baby on her hip and exhaustion etched into her face. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you Willa Hart?" Willa straightened. "I am." The woman glanced around nervously, then said, "I heard what you did, standing up to Calvin Pike. And I wanted to say thank you." Willa blinked. "Why?" "Because I was a mail-order bride too," the woman said quietly. 3 years ago. My husband's a good man, but it wasn't always easy. And seeing you refuse to be pushed around, it gave me hope that maybe things are changing." Willa's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything special." "You stood your ground," the woman said. "That's more than most of us get to do." She shifted the baby to her other hip. "Anyway, I just wanted you to know that some of us are rooting for you." She turned and walked away before Willa could respond. Willa stood there, the bucket of water forgotten, her chest tight with emotion. She thought she was fighting this battle alone, but maybe she wasn't. Come. That evening, Seth came home carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "What's that?" Willa asked. Seth set it on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a simple wooden box, handmade and smoothed to a soft finish. "I made it for you," Seth said, "for your things. I figured you didn't have a place to keep them." Willa stared at the box, her eyes stinging. It was small, nothing fancy, but the craftsmanship was careful and deliberate. "Seth, You don't have to say anything," Seth interrupted. "I just wanted you to have it." Willa picked up the box and ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "Thank you." Seth nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "It's not much." "It's perfect," Willa said. And she meant it. A few days later, the town held a community gathering at the church. A potluck supper meant to bring everyone together before the winter set in. Seth hadn't planned to go, but Mrs. Brennan stopped by the cabin and insisted. "You can't hide forever," she said bluntly. "And those kids need to see that you're not ashamed of your family." So they went. The church hall was crowded and warm, filled with the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread. Long tables were set up along one wall, covered with dishes brought by every household in town. Willa carried a basket of biscuits she'd made that morning, her stomach tight with nerves. People turned to look as they entered. Some smiled. Others didn't. Mrs. Colby stood near the front of the room, her expression pinched. But Mrs. Brennan waved them over to a table where she and her husband were sitting, and Seth led his family across the room without hesitation. They sat down, and Rosie immediately started chattering with Mrs. Brennan about the flowers she'd picked that morning. Eli sat stiffly, his eyes scanning the room for threats, and Willa sat beside Seth, trying to ignore the whispers she could feel more than hear. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Colby stood and called for everyone's attention. "Before we finish this evening, I'd like to address something that's been weighing on my heart," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Willa's stomach dropped. Mrs. Colby's gaze swept the crowd, then landed on Willa. "We have someone among us tonight who represents a troubling trend in our community. A woman living under a man's roof without the sanctity of marriage. And while I don't wish to cast judgment—" "Then don't!" Mrs. Brennan said loudly, standing up. The room went silent. Mrs. Colby's face flushed. "Excuse me, I was speaking." "And now I am," Mrs. Brennan said. "You want to talk about what's troubling in this community? Let's talk about how quick we are to tear each other down instead of building each other up. Let's talk about how we judge people based on gossip instead of character." She turned to face the crowd. "Willa Hart has done nothing wrong. She came here hoping for a better life, and when that fell apart, Seth Mercer offered her a place to stay. She's taken care of his children, kept his house, and asked for nothing in return. And instead of celebrating that kindness, half this town has decided to make her life miserable." Mrs. Colby bristled. "She's living in sin. She's living in survival," Mrs. Brennan shot back. "And if you can't see the difference, then I pity you." The room erupted in murmurs. Seth stood slowly, his face set. "Mrs. Brennan's right. Willa's been nothing but a blessing to my family, and if this town can't accept that, then we'll leave." Willa's eyes widened. "Seth!" "I mean it," Seth said, his voice steady. "I won't raise my children in a place that treats good people like criminals." The room went quiet again. Then, from the back, a man stood up. It was Mr. Brennan, the mill foreman. "I've worked with Seth for 5 years. He's one of the best men I know. And if he says this woman's good for his family, then that's good enough for me." Another man stood, then another, then a woman Willa didn't recognize. One by one, people began standing in support. Mrs. Colby looked around, her face pale, then sat down abruptly. Mrs. Brennan smiled. "I think that settles it." Seth sat down, his hand finding Willa's under the table. Willa squeezed his fingers, her eyes wet. Rosie leaned over and whispered, "Does this mean people like us now?" "Some of them," Willa whispered back, "and that's enough." They stayed for the rest of the evening, and when they finally left, the night air felt lighter. On the walk home, Eli said, "That was scary." "Yeah," Seth agreed, "but it was worth it." "Why?" Eli asked. "Because now people know where we stand," Seth said, "and they know we're not backing down." Rosie yawned. "Can we have cake when we get home?" Willa laughed. "We'll see." Back at the cabin, after the children were in bed, Seth and Willa sat on the porch steps again. "Thank you for standing up for me," Willa said. "I didn't do it for you," Seth said. "I did it for all of us." Willa leaned her head against his shoulder, and Seth didn't pull away. They sat there in the quiet, watching the stars come out, and for the first time since Willa had arrived in Red Hollow, she felt like she was home. The stars were still visible when Seth woke the next morning, but something felt different. He lay there for a moment, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, trying to place what had changed. Then he realized it was the quiet. Not the silence of grief and exhaustion he'd grown used to, but the quiet of peace. The kind that settled into a house when people stopped just surviving and started living. He got up and dressed quietly, not wanting to wake the children. When he stepped into the main room, he found Willa already awake, stoking the fire in the stove. "You're up early," he said. She glanced back at him, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Seth moved to the basin and splashed cold water on his face. "About last night?" "About everything," Willa said. She straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. "Seth, what you said at the gathering about leaving Red Hollow if the town didn't accept us, did you mean it?" Seth dried his face with a rough towel. "Every word." "But this is your home." The kids were born here. Your wife is buried here. I know, Seth said, his voice tight. But staying in a place that makes you miserable isn't the same as being home. And if people can't see what you've done for this family, then they don't deserve to have us here. Willa turned away, her shoulders tense. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. You're not, Seth said firmly. He crossed the room and stopped behind her. Willa, look at me. She turned slowly, her eyes uncertain. You didn't take anything from me, Seth said. You gave me something I thought was gone forever. You gave me hope. And I won't let anyone, not Mrs. Colby, not this whole damn town, make you feel like you don't belong here. Willa's breath hitched. I'm scared, Seth. I'm scared that one day you'll wake up and regret spending all that money. I'm scared that the kids will resent me for not being their real mother. I'm scared that I'll never be enough. Seth reached out and took her hands. You're already enough. You have been from the start. Willa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. How can you be so sure? Because I see it every day, Seth said. I see it in the way Rosie runs to you when she's hurt. I see it in the way Eli asks your opinion before he does something. I see it in the way this house feels like a home again instead of a tomb. A tear slipped down Willa's cheek, and Seth wiped it away with his thumb. I'm not asking you to be perfect, he said quietly. I'm just asking you to stay. Willa nodded, unable to speak. Seth pulled her into his arms, and she let herself lean against him, breathing in the smell of sawdust and wood smoke that clung to his shirt. They stood like that for a long time, the fire crackling softly in the stove, until they heard Rosie's small voice from the bedroom. Willa, are you making breakfast? Willa pulled back and laughed, wiping her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. I'm making breakfast. Seth smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. Moms. The days that followed the gathering were different. People in town didn't transform overnight. Red Hollow wasn't that kind of place. But there were small changes, a nod from a man who used to look away, a brief smile from a woman at the general store, an invitation from Mrs. Brennan to join the quilting circle that met every other Thursday. Willa accepted even though she wasn't much of a quilter. She went because it felt like a door opening, and she'd spent too long standing outside closed doors. The first meeting was awkward. Several of the women were friendly, but a few sat stiffly, their needles moving in silence. Mrs. Colby wasn't there. She'd stopped attending after the gathering, but her absence hung in the room like smoke. Mrs. Brennan broke the tension by asking Willa directly, You ever done much sewing? Mending mostly, Willa said. I'm not good with patterns. Then you'll fit right in, Mrs. Brennan said, gesturing to the half-finished quilt in front of her. Half of us can't follow a pattern to save our lives. A few women chuckled, and the tension eased slightly. By the end of the afternoon, Willa had managed a passable square and had learned the names of 3 women she'd only seen from a distance before. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start. Dimpak. At home, things continued to shift in small, meaningful ways. One evening, Eli came to Willa with a torn shirt. Can you fix this? Willa looked at the rip along the seam. I can, but you could too. Want me to show you? Eli frowned. That's woman's work. It's useful work, Willa corrected, and useful doesn't have a gender. Eli considered this, then nodded. Okay, show me. They sat together at the table, and Willa guided his hands through the stitches. He was clumsy at first, stabbing himself with the needle twice and cursing under his breath, but by the end, he'd managed a crooked but functional repair. It's not pretty, Eli said, holding up the shirt. It doesn't have to be, Willa said. It just has to hold. Eli smiled slightly. Yeah, I guess it does. Later that night, Seth saw the shirt hanging on the line and asked who'd fixed it. Eli did, Willa said. Seth raised an eyebrow. Eli? I taught him. He did well. Seth looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he said, You're good with them, better than I ever was. That's not true, Willa said. It is, Seth insisted. I kept them fed and alive, but you're teaching them how to live. There's a difference. Willa didn't know what to say to that, so she just touched his arm briefly and went back to washing the dishes. Basein. A few weeks later, winter began to settle over Red Hollow in earnest. The first snow came on a gray morning, soft flakes drifting down and dusting the pines. Rosie woke up, saw the white world outside the window, and shrieked with delight. "Snow! Willa, look! It's snowing!" Willa smiled. "I see it, sweetheart." "Can we go out? Can we play?" Willa glanced at Seth, who was already pulling on his coat. "After breakfast. And you have to bundle up." Rosie bounced impatiently through the entire meal, barely eating. The moment Willa gave her permission, she bolted outside with Eli trailing behind her. Seth and Willa stood on the porch, watching them chase each other through the snow. "They haven't done this in years," Seth said quietly. "Not since—" He stopped. "Not since their mother died," Willa finished gently. Seth nodded. Sarah loved the first snow. She'd take them out every year and build snowmen until their fingers were numb. Willa looked at him. "Do you want to tell me about her?" Seth hesitated, then said, "She was strong, stubborn. She didn't take nonsense from anyone, including me." A faint smile crossed his face. "She would have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so," Seth said. "She would have respected the hell out of you." Willa's throat tightened. "Thank you for telling me." Seth nodded, his eyes still on the children. "I don't talk about her much. It hurts too much. But I don't want you to think I'm trying to replace her with you." "I know you're not," Willa said. Seth glanced at her. "You're not her. You're different, and that's okay. I don't want you to be her." Willa swallowed hard. "What do you want me to be?" Seth turned to face her fully. "Yourself. That's all I've ever wanted." Before Willa could respond, Rosie called out from the yard. "Willa, come help us build a snowman." Willa laughed and stepped off the porch. Seth followed, and together they spent the next hour helping the children roll snow into lopsided spheres and stack them into something that vaguely resembled a person. It was messy and cold and chaotic, and it was the most fun Willa had had in years. But not everything was easy. The mill slowed down as winter set in, and Seth's hours were cut. He still worked 6 days a week, but the pay was less, and the strain showed in the tightness around his mouth and the way he counted coins at the table every night. One evening, Willa sat down across from him. "How bad is it?" Seth didn't look up. "We'll manage." That's not an answer. Seth sighed and set the coins down. "We've got enough for food and firewood through January. After that, I don't know." Willa's chest tightened. "Is there other work you could do?" "Not much," Seth said. "Most folks around here are in the same boat. Winter's hard on everyone." Willa thought for a moment. "I could take in sewing, mending, alterations. People always need that." Seth shook his head. "You do enough already." "I'm offering," Willa said firmly. "Let me help." Seth looked at her, his expression conflicted. "You shouldn't have to." "Neither should you," Willa said. "But here we are. So let's do it together." Seth's shoulders sagged slightly. "Okay, if you're sure." "I'm sure." Willa started the next day, putting out word through Mrs. Brennan that she was available for sewing work. The response was slow at first, but after a week she had 3 mending jobs and 1 alteration for a woman who was expecting a baby and needed her dresses let out. The work wasn't glamorous and it didn't pay much, but every penny helped. Eli noticed the pile of clothes growing in the corner and asked, "Why are you doing other people's sewing?" "Because we need the money," Willa said simply. Eli frowned. "Is it because of me and Rosie?" Willa stopped what she was doing and knelt down in front of him. "No, Eli. It's because winter is hard and we all have to pitch in. That's what families do." "But Pa used to handle everything," Eli said. "Your father's still handling everything he can," Willa said, "but he doesn't have to do it alone anymore. And neither do you." Eli looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." He started doing more around the house after that, chopping extra wood without being asked, checking the chicken coop for eggs, hauling water from the well. He didn't say much, but Willa noticed. So did Seth. One night, after Eli had gone to bed, Seth said, "He's growing up." "He is," Willa agreed. "Too fast," Seth said quietly. "I feel like I missed half of it." "You didn't miss it," Willa said. "You were just too tired to see it, but you're seeing it now." Seth looked at her. "Because of you." Willa shook her head. Because you're letting yourself. Christmas came quietly. There wasn't money for much, but Willa used scraps of fabric to make Rosie a new doll dress and stitched Eli a pair of sturdy work gloves. Seth carved each of them a small wooden animal, a horse for Rosie and a wolf for Eli. They didn't have a tree or decorations, but Willa hung pine boughs over the door and cooked a special meal with the last of the salt pork and a handful of dried apples she'd been saving. On Christmas morning, the children woke early and found their gifts waiting on the table. Rosie gasped when she saw the doll dress. "It's beautiful." Eli held up the gloves and nodded approvingly. "These will be useful." Then they turned to Willa and Seth with identical expressions of concern. "We didn't get you anything," Rosie said, her voice small. Willa knelt down and pulled her into a hug. "You already gave me everything I needed." Rosie looked confused. "What did we give you?" "A home," Willa said simply. Rosie's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around Willa's neck. Eli looked away, but Willa saw him swipe at his eyes. Seth cleared his throat. "All right, enough of that. Let's eat before the food gets cold." They sat down together, and for the first time in 3 years, the Mercer household felt complete. Shapes. But the peace didn't last. 2 days after Christmas, a man named Garrett Finch came to the cabin. Finch was a land speculator, a thin man with sharp eyes and an oily smile. He'd been buying up properties around Red Hollow for years, waiting for the town to grow so he could sell at a profit. Seth wasn't home when he arrived. Willa answered the door with Rosie hiding behind her skirts. "Can I help you?" Willa asked. Finch tipped his hat. "Mrs. Mercer?" "Miss Hart," Willa corrected. Finch's smile widened. "My mistake. Is Mr. Mercer home?" "He's at the mill." "I see." Finch glanced past her into the cabin. "Well, perhaps you can pass along a message. I'm interested in purchasing this property." Willa blinked. "This cabin?" "And the land it sits on," Finch said. "I'm prepared to offer a fair price." "It's not for sale," Willa said firmly. Finch's smile didn't waver. "Everything's for sale, Miss Hart. It's just a matter of price." "Not this," Willa said. "This is our home." Finch tilted his head. "Is it? Because from what I hear, Mr. Mercer doesn't own it. He's been leasing from the previous owner, and that lease is set to expire at the end of next month." Willa's stomach dropped. "What? Didn't he tell you?" Finch looked almost sympathetic. "The original landowner died last year, and the estate's been tied up in probate. But it's about to be settled, and I've made an offer to purchase the entire parcel. Once that goes through, Mr. Mercer's lease won't be renewed." Willa's hands clenched at her sides. "Seth would have told me." "Maybe he didn't know," Finch said. "Or maybe he was hoping it wouldn't come to this." He pulled a card from his pocket and held it out. "When he gets home, have him come see me. I'm willing to negotiate a reasonable buyout for the improvements he's made to the property." Willa took the card numbly. Finch tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving Willa standing in the doorway with her heart pounding and her mind racing. When Seth came home that evening, Willa was waiting for him. She handed him the card without a word. Seth looked at it, and his face went pale. "Finch was here?" "He said you're leasing this land," Willa said, "and that the lease expires next month." Seth closed his eyes. "Damn." "Why didn't you tell me?" Willa asked. "Because I was trying to figure it out," Seth said. "I didn't want to worry you." "Well, I'm worried now," Willa said. "What happens if we lose this place?" Seth sat down heavily at the table. "I don't know." Willa sat across from him. "How long have you known?" "About the lease expiring? A few weeks?" Seth rubbed a hand over his face. "I've been trying to scrape together enough to buy the land outright, but I'm nowhere close. Not after—" He stopped. "Not after you spent everything on me," Willa finished quietly. Seth looked at her. "I don't regret that." "But you should," Willa said, her voice breaking. "You should regret it, Seth, because now you're going to lose your home." "It's just a building," Seth said. "It's not," Willa said. "It's where your children were born. It's where your wife lived. It's everything you have." Seth reached across the table and took her hand. "You're wrong. This cabin isn't everything I have. You and the kids, that's everything I have. And I can rebuild a cabin. I can find new land, but I can't replace you." Willa's eyes filled with tears. What are we going to do? I don't know yet, Seth admitted, but we'll figure it out. Over the next few days, Seth tried everything he could think of. He went to the bank, but they wouldn't extend him credit without collateral. He asked around town for work, but there was nothing. He even swallowed his pride and went to see Finch, but the man's offer was insultingly low. Take it or leave it, Finch said with a shrug. I'm doing you a favor even offering that much. Seth walked away before he did something he'd regret. At home, the tension grew. Seth was quiet and withdrawn. Willa tried to keep things normal for the children, but Rosie sensed something was wrong. Why does Papa look so sad? She asked one night. Willa smoothed her hair. He's just worried about some grown-up things, but it'll be okay. Promise? Rosie asked. Willa hesitated, then said, I promise we'll be okay, no matter what. It is. A week before the lease expired, Mrs. Brennan showed up at the cabin with her husband. We heard about the situation, she said without preamble, and we want to help. Seth shook his head. I appreciate it, but we'll manage. Don't be stubborn, Mr. Brennan said. We've talked to some folks in town. We've put together a collection, enough to at least give you a start somewhere else if it comes to that. He held out a small cloth bag. Seth stared at it. I can't take that. You can, and you will, Mrs. Brennan said firmly. You've been part of this community for years, Seth. Let us help you now. Seth's jaw worked. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, Mr. Brennan said. Just take it. Seth took the bag, his hands shaking slightly. Thank you. After they left, Seth opened the bag and counted the money. It was $43, more than he'd expected, but nowhere near enough to buy land. Willa watched him, her chest tight. What now? Seth looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something close to defeat in his eyes. I guess we start looking for a new place. Mas. That night, Willa couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything they stood to lose. Not just the cabin, but the life they'd built here. The garden she'd planted, the memories they'd started to make, the fragile sense of belonging she'd finally found. And then an idea came to her. It was risky, maybe even foolish, but it was the only option she could think of. The next morning, she told Seth she needed to go into town alone. Why? He asked. There's something I need to do, Willa said. Trust me. Seth looked uncertain, but he nodded. Be careful. Willa walked to Red Hollow and went straight to the general store. She found Mrs. Colby there, sorting through bolts of fabric. Willa took a deep breath and approached her. Mrs. Colby, I need to speak with you. Mrs. Colby turned, her expression cold. I have nothing to say to you. Then just listen, Willa said. Please. Mrs. Colby's eyebrows rose, but she didn't walk away. Willa spoke quickly, her voice steady. I know you don't like me. I know you think I'm improper and shameful, and maybe by your standards I am. But Seth Mercer is a good man, and his children are innocent. They don't deserve to lose their home because I came into their lives. Mrs. Colby's expression didn't soften. What do you want from me? I want you to help me organize a fundraiser, Willa said. A community event to raise money so Seth can buy his land. You're the most respected woman in Red Hollow. If you support this, others will too. Mrs. Colby stared at her. You have some nerve. I know, Willa said, but I'm asking anyway. Mrs. Colby was silent for a long moment. Then she said, Why should I help you? Because it's not about me, Willa said. It's about doing what's right. And I think, deep down, you know what's right. Mrs. Colby's jaw tightened. She looked away, her fingers tapping against the fabric. Finally, she said, I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Willa nodded. Thank you for listening. She turned and walked out, her heart pounding. 3 days later, Mrs. Colby showed up at the cabin. Seth answered the door, clearly surprised. Mrs. Colby. Mr. Mercer, she said stiffly. May I come in? Seth stepped aside and Mrs. Colby entered. She looked around the cabin, taking in the clean floors, the mended curtains, the small touches that made it a home. Willa stood near the stove, her hands clasped tightly. Mrs. Colby turned to her. I've spoken with several ladies in town. We're organizing an auction and bake sale next Saturday. All proceeds will go toward helping you purchase this land. Willa's breath caught. You're helping us? Mrs. Colby's expression was unreadable. I'm helping this community. What you do with that help is up to you. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Miss Hart, you were right. Those children don't deserve to lose their home. Neither does their father. She left without waiting for a response. Willa stared after her, tears streaming down her face. Seth crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. You did this. Willa shook her head. We did this. All of us. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself hope. The week leading up to the auction felt like standing at the edge of something Willa couldn't quite see. Hope and fear twisted together in her chest until she couldn't tell them apart anymore. She threw herself into preparations, baking pies, mending clothes for people to donate, helping Mrs. Brennan organize the event. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into dark possibilities. Seth worked longer hours at the mill, trying to add every possible dollar to what they already had. He came home exhausted each night, his face drawn, but he never complained. And every evening, he sat at the table and counted their money again, as if the numbers might change if he looked at them enough times. They didn't talk about what would happen if the auction didn't raise enough. Neither of them wanted to say it out loud. Eli noticed the tension. He'd started watching his father with the same careful attention Willa had seen him use when tracking animals in the woods, alert, cautious, ready for something to go wrong. One afternoon, he cornered Willa in the kitchen while she was rolling out dough for another batch of pies. Are we going to lose the cabin? He asked bluntly. Willa's hands stilled. She could have lied, softened it, but Eli deserved better than that. I don't know yet. What happens if we do? Then we find somewhere else to live, Willa said. Your father will figure it out. Eli's jaw tightened. He shouldn't have to figure everything out by himself. He's not by himself anymore, Willa said gently. He has me, and he has you and Rosie. Eli looked down at his hands. I heard some men talking at the mill. They said Pa was a fool for spending all his money on you instead of saving it for the land. Willa's chest tightened. What do you think? Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think those men don't know anything. You made this place feel like home again. That's worth more than land. Willa's eyes burned. She set down the rolling pin and pulled Eli into a hug. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed and hugged her back. Thank you, she whispered. Eli pulled away, looking embarrassed. Just don't tell Pa I got all mushy. Willa smiled. Your secret's safe with me. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter morning where the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. The auction was set up in the church hall, and by mid-morning, nearly the entire town had shown up. Willa stood near the back with Rosie, watching people mill around the tables laden with donated goods, quilts, preserves, tools, furniture, baked goods. Seth was outside with Mr. Brennan, helping set up the larger items for bidding. Mrs. Colby arrived wearing her best dress and a stern expression. She moved through the crowd like a general inspecting troops, making sure everything was in order. When she passed Willa, she gave a brief nod. Not friendly, but not hostile either. Mrs. Brennan appeared at Willa's side. Nervous? Terrified, Willa admitted. Good, Mrs. Brennan said. That means you care, and caring's half the battle. The auction began just after noon. Mr. Brennan acted as auctioneer, his booming voice carrying through the hall as he worked through the donated items one by one. A handmade quilt went for $12. A set of tools brought in $8. A rocking chair sold for $15. Willa kept a running tally in her head, adding up each sale, trying to calculate if it would be enough. The numbers climbed slowly, $30, then $50, then $75. But they needed at least $300 to make a real difference, maybe more. Halfway through, Mrs. Colby stepped forward and donated a beautiful hand-stitched tablecloth that had been in her family for years. It sold for $22, the highest single bid of the day. Willa stared at her, stunned. Mrs. Colby didn't look in her direction, but Willa saw the slight lift of her chin, pride maybe, or defiance. Either way, it was a gift Willa hadn't expected. By the time the auction ended, the sun was low, and the hall smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon from the baked goods that had been selling all day. Mr. Brennan tallied the final count while the crowd waited in tense silence. Finally, he looked up. We raised $238. The crowd erupted in applause, but Willa's heart sank. It was a miracle. More money than she dared hope for. But it still wasn't enough. Seth appeared beside her, his face carefully neutral. It's a good start, but not enough, Willa said quietly. Seth didn't answer. Mrs. Brennan pushed through the crowd toward them. Don't look so defeated. We've still got the bake sale money to add in, and folks are still buying. By the end of the day, they'd raised another $43 from pie sales and donations. The total came to $281. Combined with what Seth already had saved and the collection the Brennans had organized, they had just over $400. It was more money than Willa had ever seen in one place. But when Seth went to see Garrett Finch the next morning, the land speculator just laughed. $400? Finch said, leaning back in his chair. The land's worth at least $6, and that's being generous. Seth's hands clenched at his sides. It's all I have. Then I guess you don't have enough, Finch said with a shrug. Look, Mercer, I'm not trying to be cruel. This is business. If you can come up with the rest in the next 2 weeks, we can talk. Otherwise, you'll need to vacate by the end of the month. Seth walked out before he said something he'd regret. When he got home, Willa was waiting on the porch. She took one look at his face and knew. He said no. Seth nodded. We're 200 short. Might as well be 2,000. Willa sat down heavily on the steps. What do we do now? Seth sat beside her, his shoulders slumped. I don't know. Start looking for somewhere else, I guess. Maybe we can rent a place in town until I figure something out. You've been figuring things out your whole life, Willa said, her voice breaking. When do you get to stop carrying everything alone? Seth looked at her. I'm not alone anymore. That's the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Willa leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in silence as the sun dipped below the ridge. That night, Willa lay awake on her cot, turning possibilities over in her mind. There had to be something they hadn't thought of, some way to make this work. And then, just before dawn, an idea came to her. It was dangerous and humiliating, but it might be their only chance. She got up before anyone else stirred, dressed quickly, and walked into town as the sky was just beginning to lighten. She went straight to Calvin Pike's boarding house. Pike answered the door in his shirt sleeves, looking surprised to see her. Well, Miss Hart. What brings you here? Willa forced herself to meet his eyes. I need to talk to you. Pike grinned. Come to beg me for money? Because I'd be happy to negotiate terms. I'm not here to beg, Willa said coldly. I'm here to make a deal. Pike's grin widened. I'm listening. Willa took a breath. You got $500 from Seth for a contract that was already void. That money should have stayed with him, with his family. Ancient history, Pike said with a shrug. Maybe, Willa said. But you're still in town, which tells me you haven't spent it all yet. And I'm guessing you're the kind of man who likes to be seen as generous when it suits him. Pike's eyes narrowed. Where are you going with this? Donate $200 to help Seth buy his land, Willa said. Do it publicly. Make it look like you're the bigger man, someone who can afford to help a struggling family even after you were wronged. Pike laughed. And why the hell would I do that? Because it'll make you look good in front of the whole town, Willa said. People will talk about how magnanimous you were, how you didn't hold a grudge. It'll help your reputation. I don't need help with my reputation, Pike said. Don't you? Willa asked. Because, from what I've heard, you've been trying to court the banker's daughter, and her father thinks you're a wastrel who can't be trusted. Proving you're capable of generosity might change his mind. Pike's smile faded. Who told you that? Does it matter? Willa said. I'm offering you a chance to be the hero of this story instead of the villain. That's worth something. Pike studied her for a long moment. Then he said, You've got guts. I'll give you that. So you'll do it? Willa asked. Pike drummed his fingers against the doorframe. Tell you what, I'll donate 100, not 2. And only because I think it'll be amusing to watch Mercer squirm knowing he's taking my money. Willa's stomach turned, but she nodded. 100 is a start. Thank you. Pike smirked. Don't thank me yet. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly why I'm doing this. Willa turned and walked away before he could see how much his words stung. Over the next 3 days, Willa worked relentlessly. She went to every business owner in Red Hollow, every farmer on the outskirts, every family she'd ever spoken to. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She just asked. Some people said no. A few were rude about it, but others, people she barely knew, pressed coins or crumpled bills into her hand and told her they believed in what Seth was trying to do. By the end of the week, she'd raised another $63. Mrs. Brennan contributed 10 more. Mr. Brennan convinced the mill owner to donate 20. Even Mrs. Colby, in a moment Willa would never forget, handed her $5 without a word. And Calvin Pike, true to his word, made a public show of donating $100, announcing it in the saloon and making sure everyone knew he was doing it out of the goodness of his heart. Willa hated every second of watching him preen and grin. But she took the money. When she finally counted everything together, they had $594. It still wasn't $600, but it was close. Seth didn't know about any of it until Willa brought the money home and spread it out on the table. He stared at it, speechless. How did you... He couldn't finish the sentence. I asked, Willa said simply. I asked everyone I could think of, and they helped. Seth looked at her, his eyes shining. Willa, you can't. You shouldn't have. I did, Willa said firmly, because this family is worth fighting for. And I'm done standing by while you carry everything yourself. Seth crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Thank you, he whispered against her hair. Thank you. The next morning, Seth went back to Garrett Finch with the money. Finch counted it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up. You're still $6 short. Seth's heart sank. $6? 6, Finch confirmed. He leaned back in his chair and studied Seth. Tell you what, I'll waive the 6 if you agree to one condition. Seth's eyes narrowed. What condition? You recommend me to anyone looking to buy or sell land in this area, Finch said. I'm trying to build a business here, and a word from you carries weight. Seth wanted to refuse. He hated the idea of helping this man profit. But he thought about Willa, about the children, about the cabin they'd fought so hard to keep. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. You've got a deal. Finch smiled and held out his hand. Pleasure doing business with you, Mercer. Seth shook it, then took the deed Finch slid across the desk. He walked out into the cold morning air with the deed clutched in his hand, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. When he got home, Willa was in the garden, pulling the last of the winter weeds. She looked up as he approached, her face anxious. Seth held up the deed. Willa's hands flew to her mouth. You did it? We did it, Seth corrected. He crossed the yard and handed her the paper. It's ours. The land, the cabin, all of it. Willa stared at the deed, tears streaming down her face. It's really ours? Really ours, Seth confirmed. Willa threw her arms around him, and Seth held her while she cried, great shaking sobs of relief and joy and exhaustion. When she finally pulled back, she was laughing through her tears. We did it. Yeah, Seth said, smiling. We did. That evening, they gathered the children and told them the news. Rosie squealed and danced around the cabin. Eli grinned, a real, unguarded smile that made him look like the child he still was underneath all his carefully constructed walls. So we're staying? Rosie asked. Forever? Forever, Seth confirmed. Rosie threw herself at Willa, nearly knocking her over. I knew you wouldn't let us lose our home. Willa hugged her tightly, her throat too tight to speak. Eli came over more slowly. He looked at Seth, then at Willa, then said quietly, Thank you. Both of you. Seth ruffled his hair. We're a family, Eli. That's what families do. Ishmkam. A week later, on a clear Saturday morning, Seth and Willa stood in front of the small church at the edge of town. It wasn't a grand affair. There were no flowers or fancy decorations. Willa wore the same dress she'd worn the day she arrived in Red Hollow, though she'd mended it and added a bit of lace at the collar. Seth wore his good shirt and a borrowed tie. Mrs. Brennan stood beside Willa as a witness. Mr. Brennan stood beside Seth. Rosie and Eli sat in the front row, Rosie bouncing with excitement and Eli trying to look solemn. The minister, a kind older man with white hair and a gentle voice, asked them the questions, and they answered. When it came time for Seth to speak his vows, he turned to Willa and took her hands. "I'm not good with words," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that marrying you isn't about duty or obligation. It's because you walked into my life when I'd given up on being happy, and you reminded me what it feels like to hope. You're the best thing that's happened to this family, and I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you've given us." Willa's eyes filled with tears. When it was her turn, she said, "I came to Red Hollow looking for a place to belong. And I found it, not in this town, but in you and your children. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You fought for me when no one else would. And you showed me that family isn't just about blood or promises written on paper. It's about showing up every day and choosing to love each other, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The minister smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Seth leaned in and kissed her, gentle and tentative at first, then deeper, like he was sealing a promise he intended to keep. The small crowd cheered. Rosie clapped so hard her hands turned red. Eli whistled, then looked embarrassed about it. And Willa realized, standing there with Seth's hand in hers, and two children who'd claimed her heart, that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not perfection, not ease, but belonging. Real, messy, complicated belonging. The months that followed weren't easy. Winter settled in hard and money was still tight. There were days when the cabin felt too small and the arguments too loud. Days when Seth came home exhausted and short-tempered, or when Willa burned supper and wanted to cry from frustration. Days when Eli retreated into sullen silence and Rosie whined about wanting things they couldn't afford. But there were good days too. Days when Seth came home early and surprised them with a small bag of candy from town. Days when Willa taught Rosie how to braid her own hair and the little girl beamed with pride. Days when Eli chopped all the wood without being asked and Seth clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Good work, son." Days when they all sat around the table after supper, talking and laughing, and Willa looked around and thought, This is what I fought for. Spring came slowly to Red Hollow, the snow melting in uneven patches and leaving the ground muddy and raw. But with it came new growth, green shoots pushing up through the dirt, buds forming on the bare branches, the promise of warmth and light after months of cold. Willa replanted the garden, this time with Rosie's help. They chose seeds together from the general store, and Rosie carefully dropped each one into the soil while Willa covered it and patted it down. "Will they really grow?" Rosie asked. "If we take care of them," Willa said. "Plants need water and sunlight and patience, just like people." Rosie thought about this. "Did you need those things too, when you first came here?" Willa smiled. "I did, and your father gave them to me." Rosie nodded seriously. "I'm glad he did. I'm glad you stayed." "Me too, sweetheart," Willa said. "Me too." One evening in late April, after the children had gone to bed, Seth and Willa sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "Do you ever regret it?" Seth asked suddenly. Willa looked at him. "Regret what?" "Staying, marrying me, all of it." Willa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'd be lying if I said it's been easy. There are days when I wonder if I'm doing enough, or if I'm failing the kids, or if you'd have been better off with someone else." Seth started to protest, but Willa held up a hand. "But no," she said, "I don't regret it. Because even on the hardest days, I'd rather be here with you and them than anywhere else in the world." Seth reached over and took her hand. "I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful. For everything you've done. For everything you are." Willa squeezed his fingers. "You don't have to say it. I see it every day in the way you look at me, in the way you trust me with your children. That's worth more than words." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the pines. Finally, Seth said, "I never thought I'd be happy again after Sarah died. I thought that part of my life was over." "And now?" Willa asked. Seth looked at her, his eyes soft in the dim light. "Now I think maybe happiness doesn't end. It just changes shape. And maybe that's okay." Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, maybe it is," he nagged. By summer, the garden was thriving. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. Beans climbed the stakes Eli had built. Carrots pushed up through the soil in neat rows. Willa spent her mornings tending it, her hands deep in the dirt, the sun warm on her back. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was satisfying in a way she'd never experienced before. One afternoon, Mrs. Brennan stopped by with a basket of preserves. "Thought you might like these," she said, handing them over. "And I wanted to see how you were settling in." "We're doing well," Willa said. "Better than I expected, honestly." Mrs. Brennan looked around the property. The neat garden, the freshly painted fence, the children playing in the yard. "You've made a real home here." "We all have," Willa said. "It wasn't just me," Mrs. Brennan smiled. "No, but you were the spark. Don't underestimate that." After she left, Willa thought about those words. She'd never seen herself as a spark, just someone trying to survive, to find a place where she fit. But maybe that was enough. Maybe survival and hope weren't so different after all. Baksh. In August, the town held a summer festival. There were games and races for the children, food stalls set up along the main street, and dancing in the square as the sun went down. Willa had been nervous about attending, but Seth insisted. "We're part of this community now," he said. "Might as well act like it." So they went, all four of them. And it was better than Willa had expected. People greeted them warmly. Children ran up to play with Rosie and Eli. Someone asked Seth to help judge the pie contest, and he accepted with a rare smile. And when the music started and couples began dancing, Seth turned to Willa and held out his hand. "I'm not very good," he warned. "Neither am I," Willa said. They danced anyway, clumsy and laughing, under the summer stars. And Willa realized that this imperfect, messy, beautiful life was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. That fall, Eli turned 10. Willa baked a cake, and they had a small celebration at the cabin. It wasn't much, just the four of them and Mrs. Brennan, who'd become something like family. But when Eli blew out the candles and looked around at the people gathered there, Willa saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Contentment. Later, as she was cleaning up, Eli pulled her aside. "I wanted to give you something," he said, holding out a small carved wooden bird. Willa took it carefully. It was rough in places, the wings not quite even, but it was unmistakably a bird in flight. "I made it," Eli said, looking embarrassed. "It's not very good." "It's perfect," Willa said, her throat tight. "Thank you, Eli." Eli ducked his head. "You're welcome. And I wanted to say, I'm glad you're here. I know I didn't make it easy at first, but I'm glad you stayed." Willa pulled him into a hug. "I'm glad I stayed too." As winter approached again, Willa found herself thinking about the year that had passed, about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The cabin still creaked in the wind, money was still tight. The town still had its share of gossips and judgment, but the fear was gone. The loneliness was gone. The desperate scramble to survive had been replaced by something quieter, steadier. One evening, as she was putting Rosie to bed, the little girl asked, "Willa, are you my mama now?" Willa's breath caught. She'd heard Rosie call her that once before by accident, but this was different. This was a question. "Do you want me to be?" Willa asked gently. Rosie thought about it seriously. "I think so. I don't remember my first mama very much, but I think she'd like you." Willa's eyes filled with tears. "I think she would too." Rosie snuggled into her blankets. "Then yes, you're my mama." Willa kissed her forehead. "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Mama." Willa stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the words settle into her heart. Tumkets. That night she told Seth what Rosie had said. Seth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad. The kids need you, and so do I." Willa looked at him. "You know what I've learned this year?" "What's that?" "That family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build. One day at a time, one choice at a time." Seth nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think you're right." Willa moved closer to him. "And I've learned that home isn't a place. It's the people you choose to love and who choose to love you back." Seth pulled her into his arms. "When did you get so wise?" Willa laughed. "I'm not wise. I'm just stubborn." That too, Seth said, kissing the top of her head. The truth was, Willa had learned something else too. Something she'd never expected. She'd learned that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up when things were hard. It was about fixing what was broken, even when it seemed hopeless. It was about choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. She'd come to Red Hollow looking for a fresh start, expecting to find it in a man who'd ordered her like a piece of furniture and then thrown her away. Instead, she'd found it in the hardest, most unexpected place. In a grieving widower, 2 wounded children, and a town that didn't know what to make of her. And somehow, through all the struggle and uncertainty and fear, they'd built something that mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Because that's what redemption looked like. Not a single moment of transformation, but 1,000 small choices to keep going, to keep trying, to keep loving even when it hurt. Winter came again, as it always did. But this time, the cabin was ready. The woodpile was stacked high. The pantry was full of preserves and dried goods. The roof had been patched, the windows sealed against the cold. And inside, the Mercer family, whole now in a way they hadn't been before, gathered around the table for supper. Seth said grace, though it was simple and secular, just a moment of gratitude for the food and the people gathered there. Rosie chattered about her day. Eli listened and occasionally contributed a dry comment that made everyone laugh. Willa served stew and fresh bread, watching them all with a quiet satisfaction that settled deep in her bones. Later, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Seth and Willa stood at the window watching the snow fall. "You know what?" Seth said. "What? I'm not sad anymore," he said quietly. "I mean, I still miss Sarah. I always will. But I'm not carrying it the same way. It doesn't weigh me down like it used to." "That's good," Willa said. Seth turned to look at her. "It's because of you. You taught me that it's okay to let go of the grief and make room for something new." Willa shook her head. "You did that yourself. I just walked beside you while you figured it out." Seth smiled. "Maybe we walked together." "Yeah," Willa said. "Maybe we did." Years would pass. Children would grow. Seasons would change. Eli would leave home at 17 to work at a ranch 2 towns over, then come back 3 years later with a wife and a fierce pride in the land his father had fought to keep. Rosie would become a teacher, fierce and kind, carrying forward the lessons she'd learned from a woman who wasn't her blood, but was her mother in every way that mattered. Seth and Willa would grow old together in that cabin, their hands worn and their faces lined, but their love deepening with every passing year. And when people asked Willa about her story, how she'd ended up in Red Hollow, how she'd built a life from nothing, she'd tell them the truth. That she'd been lost, and then she'd been found. Not by one person, but by a whole family who'd needed her as much as she'd needed them. That she'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You just have to be willing to try. That home isn't a place you arrive at. It's a place you create, piece by piece, with the people brave enough to build it alongside you. And that sometimes, the best things in life come from the moments when everything falls apart and you're forced to rebuild from scratch. Because that's when you discover what really matters. That's when you learn who you really are. Willa Hart had come to Red Hollow carrying nothing but a worn suitcase and a shattered dream. And she'd left behind a legacy that had nothing to do with wealth or status or respectability. She'd left behind a family, a real one. Built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and courage and the stubborn refusal to give up when the world said it was hopeless. And in the end, that was worth more than any piece of paper, any amount of money, any dream she'd carried when she first stepped off that train. Because she'd learned the most important truth of all, that you don't need to be saved by someone else. Sometimes you save yourself. And sometimes, the real miracle is when you find people who'll stand beside you while you do it. The snow kept falling outside the cabin, soft and steady, covering the world in quiet white. Inside, the fire crackled. The children slept peacefully. And Seth and Willa stood together at the window, their hands intertwined, watching the night deepen and knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it the same way they'd faced everything else, together. And that was more than enough.